Have you ever watched someone's racism backfire so spectacularly in a courtroom that the entire room fell silent in shock? Because that's exactly what happened when a pompous attorney named Richard Pemberton assumed the well-dressed black man sitting quietly in the gallery was just another defendant, publicly mocking him in front of dozens of witnesses, calling him one of those people who should learn their place in society, never once imagining that the man he was humiliating was actually Judge Marcus Thorne, the newly appointed federal judge who would be presiding over his case in exactly 10 minutes. And what happened next became the most epic courtroom justice moment I've witnessed in my 20 years as a court reporter. Let me take you to the Manhattan Federal Courthouse on a cold February morning, where the hallways buzzed with the usual chaos of lawyers reviewing last-minute briefs, defendants nervously waiting for their hearings, and families hoping for mercy from the system. Marcus Thorne wasn't supposed to be sitting in the gallery that morning. As the newly appointed federal judge, he should have been in his chambers preparing to take the bench for the first time in his new role. But his assistant had called in sick. His robe was still at the dry cleaners, and he'd arrived an extra hour early to observe the outgoing judge's final cases and get a feel for the courtroom dynamics before his official debut. So there he sat, a distinguished 48-year-old black man in an impeccably tailored navy suit, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his hands folded patiently on his lap as he watched the proceedings with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 3 decades in the legal profession. First, as a public defender in the Bronx where he'd fought for the voiceless. Then as a civil rights attorney who'd taken on police brutality cases that other lawyers were too afraid to touch. And now as one of the youngest federal judges ever appointed to the Southern District of New York. Marcus had deliberately chosen to sit in the public gallery rather than announce himself because he believed in observing how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. It was a philosophy he'd learned from his grandmother, a woman who'd marched with Dr. King and taught him that a person's true character reveals itself in how they treat those they believe can't help or hurt them. That's when Richard Pemberton made his entrance. And I use that word deliberately because this man didn't simply walk into a courtroom, he performed. He strutted in with the kind of arrogance that comes from 30 years of winning cases through intimidation, family connections, and the unspoken privilege of being a white man in expensive suits who'd never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Pemberton was representing a major pharmaceutical company in a class action lawsuit. And from the moment he stepped through those doors with his junior associates trailing behind him like nervous ducklings, you could feel the atmosphere shift. He was the kind of lawyer who treated court staff like servants, who interrupted judges mid-sentence because he believed his time was more valuable, who had a documented history of making racist remarks that somehow never quite stuck because his firm's senior partners always smoothed things over with donations and connections. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to Axiom USA for more real stories of injustice and justice. Marcus watched as Pemberton barked orders at his team, snapped his fingers at the court clerk demanding immediate attention, and made a disparaging comment about the incompetence of public defenders loud enough for the entire room to hear, including the 3 public defenders sitting at the opposite table who were handling a pro bono case for a group of tenants facing illegal eviction. But Pemberton's true colors revealed themselves when he noticed Marcus, sitting calmly in the 3rd row of the gallery. His eyes narrowed with that particular look of disdain that black people in professional spaces know all too well, the look that says, "You don't belong here," without speaking a single word. Pemberton leaned over to whisper something to his associate, and they both glanced back at Marcus with barely concealed contempt before Pemberton decided to make his feelings public. "Excuse me," Pemberton said loudly, pointing directly at Marcus with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from decades of unchecked privilege. "You in the gallery, this is a complex federal case, not traffic court. So if you're waiting for your public defender to show up for whatever petty crime you're being charged with, you need to wait outside because this courtroom is about to handle serious legal matters that require a certain level of sophistication to understand." The words hung in the air like a slap, and I watched Marcus's expression remain completely neutral. Not a flicker of anger or surprise, just a calm, observational stillness that should have warned Pemberton he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Several lawyers in the room shifted uncomfortably. A few court staff members exchanged shocked glances, and one of the public defenders started to stand up to object. But Marcus gave the slightest shake of his head, a silent message to let this play out. Pemberton, emboldened by what he mistook for submission, continued his assault. And frankly, I'm tired of these courtrooms being treated like community centers where anyone can just wander in off the street. We have standards. We have protocols, and if you can't afford proper representation or understand the complexity of federal litigation, then maybe you should reconsider whatever choices led you to be here in the first place. The racist implications were crystal clear. The assumption that a black man in a courtroom must be a defendant, must be poor, must be uneducated, must be there because of poor choices rather than professional purpose. Marcus could have revealed himself right then, could have stood up and announced his position, but he chose to wait, to let Pemberton dig his hole deeper, to give him every opportunity to show exactly who he was when he thought he held all the power. Nothing to say for yourself? Pemberton sneered when Marcus remained silent. That's what I thought. People like you never have anything substantive to contribute. You just take up space and waste everyone's time. If you're feeling this story, hit that like button and share this video to support Axiom USA and help us reach more people who need to hear these truths. One of Pemberton's own junior associates, a young black woman named Jasmine, who'd been trying to survive in that toxic firm for 2 years, looked absolutely mortified, her face showing the internal battle between keeping her job and speaking up against this blatant racism. The public defenders were visibly angry, court staff members were whispering urgently to each other, and even some of the other attorneys in the room who'd probably stayed silent during Pemberton's previous racist moments seemed uncomfortable with how explicit this attack had become. But Marcus simply checked his watch, made a note in the small leather journal he always carried, and continued to observe with that same unnerving calm that comes from someone who's faced racism so many times they've learned to weaponize patience. The bailiff, a veteran named Tony Rodriguez who'd worked in federal courts for 15 years and had clearly figured out who Marcus was, looked like he was struggling not to intervene, his hand hovering near his radio as if debating whether to call for security or just let this train wreck continue to its inevitable conclusion. "Sir," Tony finally said carefully, addressing Pemberton, "perhaps you should check with the clerk about—" But Pemberton cut him off with an imperious wave. "I don't need a bailiff telling me how to conduct myself in a courtroom. I've been practicing federal law since before you were probably born. So unless you're about to remove this man for loitering, I suggest you focus on your actual job." The disrespect was breathtaking, the audacity staggering, and Marcus made another note in his journal, his face still betraying nothing but perhaps the slightest hint of something that might have been amusement. The clock ticked toward 9 p.m., the official start time for the session, and the outgoing judge's clerk appeared at the chamber door to make an announcement that would change everything. "All rise. This court is now in session, but before we begin, I need to inform counsel that Judge Morrison has taken ill and will not be presiding today. Instead, we are honored to have the newly appointed Judge Marcus Thorne making his first appearance on the bench. Please welcome Judge Thorne. Want to hear more real stories of racism and justice every week? Subscribe to Axiom USA and never miss these powerful moments." The room erupted in polite applause as Marcus stood from his seat in the gallery, buttoned his suit jacket with unhurried precision, and walked calmly down the aisle toward the bench, his stride confident and measured, his expression now showing the full weight of judicial authority. The color drained from Pemberton's face so quickly I thought he might actually faint. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His hand gripped the table for support, and his junior associates took a collective step backward as if trying to distance themselves from the impending disaster. Marcus took the bench, adjusted the microphone, and surveyed the courtroom with the same calm observation he'd shown while being insulted, letting the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to fully grasp the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "I am Judge Marcus Thorne. And I want to begin my tenure on this bench by addressing something that just happened in this courtroom, something that I witnessed firsthand, and that I will not allow to be swept under the rug or minimized. Pemberton tried to speak, his voice cracking. "Your Honor, I had no idea. I sincerely apologize." But Marcus raised one hand for silence, and the gesture carried such command that Pemberton's mouth snapped shut immediately. "Mr. Pemberton," Marcus continued, his tone professional but laced with steel, "for the record, let me address your assumptions. I am not here because of a petty crime. I did not wander in off the street. I do not require a public defender. And I certainly understand the complexity of federal litigation, considering I've practiced it for 3 decades, taught it at Columbia Law School, and now have the authority to adjudicate it from this bench." The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the air conditioning humming, everyone frozen in their seats watching this moment of accountability unfold. "Furthermore," Marcus said, pulling out his small leather journal, "I want to read back exactly what you said to me, because words matter, especially in a court of law. You told me I was one of those people who should learn their place in society. You suggested I was here for a petty crime. You claim people like me never have anything substantive to contribute. And you stated that we just take up space and waste everyone's time. Mr. Pemberton, would you like to explain to this court what you meant by people like me and what exactly you believe my place in society should be?" Pemberton's face had progressed from pale to crimson, sweat beading on his forehead, and his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Your Honor." I spoke in haste. I was stressed about the case. "I didn't mean—" But Marcus interrupted firmly. "You didn't mean what exactly? You didn't mean to be racist, or you didn't mean to get caught being racist? Because from where I sat, literally from where I sat in that gallery observing you, your words were deliberate, your tone was contemptuous, and your assumptions were based entirely on the color of my skin. Because I guarantee that if a white man in a similar suit had been sitting in that same seat, you would not have assumed he was a defendant, would not have questioned his right to be present, and certainly would not have suggested he lacked the sophistication to understand complex litigation." The truth of those words resonated through the room, and I saw several people nodding, including some of the other attorneys who'd probably experienced or witnessed Pemberton's behavior before. Marcus continued, his voice never rising but carrying the full weight of judicial authority. "Mr. Pemberton, I've reviewed your file, and this is not the first complaint of discriminatory behavior associated with your name. You've had 3 formal complaints filed with the Bar Association in the past 5 years, all from opposing counsel or court staff, all alleging similar racist or discriminatory remarks, and all mysteriously resolved through your firm's connections without any real consequences." Pemberton's junior associate. Jasmine looked like she wanted to applaud but maintained her professional composure, though her eyes were bright with vindication. "So here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "First, you will issue a formal written apology not just to me, but to every person of color who has had to endure your condescension in this courtroom and in your professional practice. Second, I am referring your conduct to the Bar Association for a full disciplinary review, and I will be personally submitting my testimony as a witness to your behavior. Third, I am recusing myself from your case because I cannot be impartial after being subjected to your racist tirade, but I will be assigning it to Judge Chen, who I know will scrutinize your conduct and arguments with appropriate skepticism. And fourth, you will attend mandatory diversity and ethics training before you're allowed to argue in this district again. And if you refuse any of these conditions, I will hold you in contempt, and you can explain your behavior to a disciplinary committee while sitting in a cell, the power of institutional authority being used to confront racism rather than protect it was stunning to witness, and you could feel the energy shift in the room. Pemberton looked like he was considering whether to argue, but even his arrogance couldn't overcome the reality of his situation. He'd publicly humiliated a federal judge based on racist assumptions. It was witnessed by dozens of people, and there was no firm connection powerful enough to make this disappear. "Your Honor, I accept all conditions," he managed to say, his voice hollow. Marcus nodded once. "Good. Now I want to address everyone else in this courtroom. Because what happened here today is not just about one man's racism. It's about a system that too often protects that racism, enables it, and allows it to flourish as long as it's not too explicit, too public, or too inconvenient. He looked around the room, making eye contact with lawyers, staff, and observers. How many of you have witnessed behavior like this before and said nothing? How many times have you heard a colleague make a racist remark and convinced yourself it wasn't your place to intervene? How many people have suffered in silence because speaking up felt too risky, too complicated, or too likely to hurt their own careers? The questions landed heavily, and I saw several people look down, uncomfortable with the mirror being held up to their own complicity. I'm not asking these questions to shame you, Marcus continued, his tone softening slightly but losing none of its gravity. I'm asking because change requires all of us to be active participants, not passive observers. It requires junior associates like Ms. Jasmine Walker over there. He nodded toward Pemberton's associate. To know that when they witness this behavior, they can report it without fear of retaliation, and if they face retaliation, this court will be their shield. Jasmine's eyes widened with surprise and something like hope. It requires court staff, bailiffs, clerks, and fellow attorneys to speak up in the moment, to refuse to normalize racism by treating it as just someone's personality quirk or stress response. And it requires those of us in positions of power to use that power to create accountability rather than excuse it. Marcus paused, letting his words settle. So let me be absolutely clear about how I will run my courtroom. Racism, sexism, homophobia, or any form of discrimination will not be tolerated here. Not in arguments, not in sidebar comments, not in how you treat opposing counsel, court staff, or anyone else in this space. You will maintain professionalism. You will treat everyone with dignity regardless of their role or race. And if you can't do that, you are not welcome in my courtroom, regardless of how prestigious your firm is or how important you think your case is. The statement was a line in the sand, a declaration that this space would operate under different rules, and I could see the impact on people's faces. Relief for those who'd been on the receiving end of such behavior. Discomfort for those who'd benefited from the old norms. Marcus wrapped up his opening with a vision. I'm honored to serve on this bench, and I promise you that my courtroom will be a place where justice is truly blind. Blind to race, blind to wealth, blind to connections. We will focus on facts, law, and the Constitution, and every person who enters here will be treated with the dignity they deserve simply by virtue of being human. The room erupted in genuine applause, not the polite, perfunctory clapping of formal courtroom procedure, but real appreciation from public defenders who'd been disrespected too many times, from court staff who'd witnessed this behavior too often, from young lawyers of color who'd never seen someone in power take such an explicit stand. As Pemberton gathered his materials with shaking hands and left the courtroom, followed by his firm's representatives who'd been urgently summoned, Marcus called Jasmine forward. Ms. Walker, a moment, please, she approached nervously. Yes, Your Honor? Marcus's expression softened. I saw your face during that exchange, and I know the position you're in, working at a firm where speaking up could cost you your career, where you've probably witnessed behavior like this before and felt powerless to stop it. I want you to know that if you ever need a reference for another position, or if you face any retaliation for being associated with this incident, my chamber's door is open, and I know several firms in this district who value integrity over prestige. Tears welled in Jasmine's eyes as she nodded. Thank you. Your Honor, you have no idea how much that means. 3 weeks later, the story came out. Pemberton's Bar Association review revealed a pattern of racist behavior spanning his entire career, including complaints from black associates at his firm who'd been quietly paid off to avoid publicity, racist jokes recorded in firm emails that had been ignored by senior partners, and testimony from opposing counsel about his courtroom conduct. He was suspended from practice for 6 months, required to complete extensive ethics training, and placed on probation for 2 years. His firm, embarrassed by the publicity and facing potential lawsuits from former employees who felt emboldened to speak out, quietly asked him to retire early, though they dressed it up as a mutual decision. Jasmine left the firm and joined a prestigious civil rights organization where her talents were actually valued, and she later told reporters that watching Marcus stand up to Pemberton had given her the courage to stand up for herself. Marcus's courtroom became known as one of the fairest in the district, where public defenders and high-powered attorneys received equal respect, where racist dog whistles were immediately called out, and where justice was pursued without the prejudice that had infected too many legal spaces for too long. The story went viral in legal circles, became a teaching moment in law schools about implicit bias and the importance of allies using their power to create change, and sparked conversations about racism in the legal profession that had been overdue for decades. Thanks for watching Axiom USA, where we tell the stories that matter, the stories that challenge injustice and celebrate those who stand up against it. Like, share, and subscribe, because every view helps us reach someone who needs to hear that change is possible, that standing up makes a difference, and that your voice matters in the fight for justice. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one judge confronting one racist lawyer. It was about what happens when people in power choose accountability over comfort, when they use their platform to protect rather than punish, and when they refuse to let racism hide behind professionalism or prestige. And that's a lesson we all need to carry forward. Because change doesn't happen when we stay silent. It happens when we speak up, when we stand together, and when we refuse to accept that this is just how things are. Because if Marcus could turn his own humiliation into a teaching moment that changed an entire courtroom's culture, imagine what we could do if we all committed to calling out injustice wherever we see it. Not next time, not when it's convenient, but right in the moment when it matters most.